This is TWiT.
Denise, did you read the 450-page report now?
I cannot claim to have read the 450-page report. I think it's funny that your lead-in is the Casper ad, because are you trying to suggest that congressional antitrust findings are sleep-inducing?
Oh, Lord.
I would beg to differ. And I think that the point that you and Christina were making about Microsoft is not just interesting, but actually super important, and a good sort of, I don't know, overview gloss on considering all this is when go back and remember that Microsoft was under antitrust scrutiny from 1990 through 2002, 12 years.
Yikes.
Yeah. So, and it just dragged on and on. And now they're not even, the mentions in the report are referencing all that past stuff we learned about going after a tech giant in antitrust proceedings. And they're, so what it reminds me of most of all is that famous quote from Ferris Bueller that life moves pretty fast. And if you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. I feel like in this industry, life moves very fast, and life has moved quite fast for Microsoft, and they are no longer an antitrust threat as far as Congress is concerned. And if they looked around a little while, they might find that Google and or Facebook and or Apple and or Amazon might be less of a threat a little ways down the road too. I mean, it's a very fluid kind of business. Does anyone really feel that Facebook is going to be the be all and end all of social networking, say 12 years from now? I don't think so. But
I'm going to say something controversial. I guess. I think that the DOJ action against Microsoft was a success. And that the consent decree that Microsoft eventually did sign up for, which include, by the way, somebody on site, an ombudsman on site, monitoring their behavior to make sure that they didn't behave anti-competitively, helped Microsoft a lot. It steered them in the right direction. It paved the way for things like Google and Facebook to emerge. And Microsoft's done very well. I think that it was actually a success on both sides. It was good for Microsoft, and I think it was good for the country. Is that?
Yeah, I'm not going to dispute that at all. But I do feel like what Congress has done here is basically take on these companies for being big as opposed to being monopolies and or engaging in anti-competitive practices. And that's sort of where I feel like they lost their bipartisan support, and where I feel like this could just sort of peter out. I guess the biggest part of the report, the biggest ask that it makes is for Congress to alter the antitrust laws so that they have more flexibility, and maybe the antitrust laws resemble more or relate more to what's going on in the current technology industry, which, you know, they're very ill-fitted to right now. And you had that great piece in the rundown on anti-monopoly versus
Ben Thompson.
Antitrust. Yes, Ben Thompson's piece. I encourage people to read that. That's really good.
He quotes a scholar in economic policy, William Letwin, who wrote a book on the evolution of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And actually, I want to read this quote because it kind of gets to the heart of the matter. Letwin says that hatred of monopoly is one of the oldest American political habits. And like most profound traditions, it consisted of an essentially permanent idea expressed differently at different times. Monopoly, as the word was used in America, meant at first a special legal privilege granted by the state, like your cable company has a monopoly, unfortunately. Later, it came to more often mean exclusive control that a few persons achieved by their own efforts, but it always meant some sort of unjustified power, especially one that raised obstacles to the equality of opportunity. And I think that is a legitimate fear. If there is a failing in the free market economy, it is that it is possible in a free market economy for a company to become so powerful that its dominance allows it to enter and control other markets, which essentially destroys the competition that makes free market work. And so I think that is one of the few controls that a government must exert on a free market, is this control of monopoly. Now, Phil, I have no idea where you stand on this, so I'm going to let you tell me I'm full of it if you want.
I think this is the man with a hammer syndrome, right? Mm-hmm. If you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right.
I think that the big tech companies are doing a lot of harm to the world. A lot of good as well, but clearly some harm. And I think they're looking into the kind of harm that they're causing and trying to figure out ways to mitigate that harm is super important. I'm just not sure that breaking them up actually achieves that in any way. I think
as Christina pointed out, we didn't break up Microsoft, but we still were able to accomplish some things.
Yeah, and I think that the harm that Microsoft was doing, even allegedly, and I kind of agree with you that it was probably the consent decree was probably a good thing overall, but that was like, okay, yeah, I guess they're shutting out some competitors. The harm that Facebook's doing has much more to do with like the harm they're causing to the rest of the world, not so much on companies that may want to compete with Facebook.
Yes.
I think
yes.
Antitrust is a very narrow lens to look at this through, and the idea that like the reflexive reaction is let's break the companies up. Like I think that's going to make a lot of things worse.
Yeah.
Like I think Facebook broken up into 10 parts is completely not clear to me why that's not 10 times worse than Facebook right now. Well, it's just like the easy answer.
As Denise pointed out, I mean, the good news is, A, this is not even a nonpartisan report. The Republicans disagree about the breaking up as well. B, Congress has a few other things to think about. C, there's an election 3 weeks away, and they're going to be a lame duck Congress. It doesn't look like anything's going to be happening anytime soon.
And I really like Phil's point that we don't necessarily need a hammer and this isn't necessarily a nail. There are a lot of other laws that are available. I'm thinking, California pops to mind, has a really broad and sweeping unfair competition law. And it seems like some of the things that are complained about in the 450-page report, by the way, Wired has a really nice 14 juiciest quotes from the House Antitrust report. If you're looking for a cheat sheet.
Now that is clearly link bait. There is nothing juicy in this report. It's okay, good. I'm going to have to look that up.
Looking for sort of the meat and what, it's hard. From the coverage I've read of it, and as I said, I did not go through all 450 pages, but what commentators tend to come up with, having read through it, and God love them for having done that for us, is that there wasn't a lot of concrete example given of anti-competitive or monopolistic behavior. Yeah, the complaint seemed to be we've got big companies doing bad things.
Right.
If we've got if we've got any company doing bad things, we have a lot of laws we can use to address that.
I actually think that Phil, you nailed it, so to speak, because for instance, the problem with Facebook is not that they're so big; it's the monopoly, not a monopoly. And Facebook defends itself, saying, "Well, there's the whole internet to compete with us." It's just that they have such power and dominance over the discourse in this country that's scary.
Yeah,
not just this country, but the world.
The world, yes.
Yeah, I think there's a class of problems that can be solved by restricting what companies do in general, and there's a different class of problems and a much smaller class of problems that could be solved by breaking up like a single company. And we just, I think for historical reasons, just, immediately go to they're big and so they break them up. And it just never made any sense to me. Like if you had 10 companies and they were all, they were all just dumping cyanide into the water because, that's what they decided to do. But there was 10 of them. Clearly none of them were a monopoly. There were just 10 and they were equally sized and there were 10 companies dumping cyanide into the water and like killing everyone.
Right. That's a problem.
Antitrust is not the solution to that. You would just be like, hey, no company can now dump cyanide into the water. You wouldn't like take the biggest one and break them up, which wouldn't necessarily fix the problem. And this is what we have now. We have like social media makes money by keeping you upset.
Yes.
Like social media makes money when you are upset.
Yes.
And that's a problem. And it's a problem if there's a monopoly doing it. And it's a problem if there's 50 companies evenly distributed doing it. The problem is that business model is deeply detrimental to the world and shouldn't exist. I'm like, I share, I think, a lot of the suspicion of big tech and the desire to improve it. But I think, the only people I trust less are probably the Congress. And B, yeah, I think antitrust is just it just doesn't seem like the right fit, the right framework for this at all.
Here's one example from that 14 juiciest quotes piece in Wired that jumped out at me. One of the things the report calls out is that certain employees at Amazon, were other Seattle company, were getting information about the third-party sellers marketplace due to their role at Amazon, the data they were able to access because there were employees there. And then they were establishing their own side hustle where they could compete more readily as a third-party seller on the marketplace because of the information that they're getting straight from their employer. Well, that's not the employer's problem, except for those people should be fired and disciplined. That's not an antitrust issue.
Well, and I should also point out, as others have, that Walmart does the same thing. Every grocery store in the country can do the same thing. They know what's selling. And when grocery store came out with generic goods, unlabeled goods, I'm sure they use data about which products sold the best to determine which generic goods to sell. That's called retail.